musical world of plastic manufactured acts and conventional copycats, the Darkness have managed to break down the accepted barriers of the popular and bring rock music back to the masses. Eschewing the hip and thuggish world of modern metal, the dynamic four-piece have revitalised rock, acknowledging the roots of the genre and returning it to its flamboyant, eccentric past. With a keen sense of fun and the excitement of rock music, the band have grown from national heroes to international icons. This is the story of the Darkness, from East Coast rockers to stadium rock gods. Lowestoft, a seaside town at the most easterly point of the British Isles. It was in this relatively inauspicious hometown that Justin Hawkins, Dan Hawkins and Ed Graham, the three founding members of Rock Goliath the Darkness, grew up.
Well, Lowestoft was a pretty quiet place, you know. There's a lot of retired old people come here to retire, obviously, yeah. But, you know, at the end of the day, there's not much for young people to do, I suppose, in Lowestoft. It was the same 10 years ago and it's still the same nowadays, you know. They don't think much of the young people, you know. It's more of an old person's place and I think that's the way they want to keep it at the end of the day. But, you know, it's always been like that, I suppose. So, yeah, I don't think it's going to ever change either, yeah.
Within this quiet community, the Hawkins brothers slowly developed an interest in music. With Justin in particular, there were early signs of his future flamboyance and showmanship.
One of the first signs that Justin Hawkins was going to grow up to be the, incredible rock star that he has was when he was probably nothing more than a toddler, and his mother, Sandy, has recalled that, there were quite a few budding photographers in the family and they'd take a lot of pictures, and no matter what kind of picture they were taking, even if it was of a dog or a hamster, Justin would creep his way into it with a thumb extended, as bizarrely enough became his thing later on in his career.
Both Dan and Justin were enrolled in Kirkley High School during their formative years. It was here that Dan met classmate Ed Graham. All three are warmly remembered by the staff.
Oh, well, Justin was a lively youngster. He's always up for a laugh, big smile on his face. Just a fun guy, really seemed to really enjoy life. Dan was quieter. Dan was much quieter, much kind of steadier, sort of serious almost. But yeah, he seemed to have really quite much more focused on what he wanted to do. Whereas Justin was experimenting all the time with new things and new ideas, new clothes. Because in those days there was no kind of school uniform like today. So yeah, Dan was quite different in that respect.
I met Dan Hawkins about a decade or so ago when I was teaching English at GCSE level, and Dan was one of my most popular English students.
Even from this early age, Dan and Justin's interest in music was evident to their school friends and teachers.
Throughout his Kirkley High days, he and his brother were always keen on that side of things. I can recall Dan putting his head around my form room door once and asking if I had any good names for a band. So I can't claim Biff or perhaps even the Darkness, but we talked about the names of other bands based on characters from books that we'd read.
Ed Graham was also heavily preoccupied with music during his school years. Less eccentric than Justin and less studious than Dan, Ed is now principally remembered for his instrument of choice.
Didn't know Ed that well, but he was just a drummer. Ed was the guy who came into class with his pencils, sat in front of my desk, didn't say much, kept his head down, didn't listen much, I don't think, and played the drums. It used to drive me to distraction at times, but that's what I was into. He had some beat in his head all the time, and that's what he did. He kept his head down and played with his pencils on desktops a lot. But yeah, he's a nice guy. He did some work and he got good grades and stuff, but that was music. He was into drumming then, big time, and that's what I was into.
How did I come to meet Ed? He'd been praising his mother for drum lessons for some time, from what I can remember, and his mother rang me up and said, could you teach Ed? And she brought him along one day, and I brought him up the studio, and let him sit down on the drum kit and have a go, see if he had the feel, which he did. And then I went on to teach him for a couple of years after that. As a young kid, Ed was shy. He was so shy that he didn't actually have a face. His hair used to hang down in front of his face, and when you used to ask him a question, he used to part these like curtains, and this little face used to appear, and you'd get the answer, and then the curtains would come back, and he would disappear again. He was the shyest student I've ever taught. How he ever ended up in a band as exuberant as the Darkness, I'll never know. He's the exact opposite of Justin, the singer.
The three young musicians began to perform in a variety of local bands and came into contact with John Allen, owner of Lowestoft's biggest rehearsal and recording studio, the Sound House. A former professional drummer, Allen first met Justin in the late 80s.
Justin was insane. He was just totally off the wall, doing his own thing. He didn't really care what people thought. He obviously enjoyed what he was doing, but it was totally out of anything that anybody else around here was doing. It was completely individual. Dan was much quieter. Dan was much more studious about what he was going to do, and he wasn't as obvious. I mean, he was playing. Justin was obvious. It was obvious, you know. It was obvious what Justin was going to do. He was never going to do anything else. Ed used to come in here. Ed used to scare the life out of me because he used to use my kit. And it's an old kit and it's a nice kit. And I used to go, no, you're not. So he got stopped. Which I certainly didn't feel bad about. I sort of felt guilty, but that's, you know, just from the point of view of I didn't want something reduced to match with. But he was, I didn't really know, and he was quite insular. He still stayed to his own thing, but he used to come in here and he used to knock 7 bells out of drum kits. I know, and he really did, just no technique. I think he went off and got lessons. Well, obviously he went off and got lessons somewhere along the line, but yeah, he was very quiet. He was a strange kid, but when he got behind the kit, he was off, and I used to stand there and watch him and think, oh my God. But you know, he's done all right for himself, so good for him.
Ed certainly had an innate ability. He certainly had just a natural feel for rhythm and to sit down at the drum kit and play. And he was just a natural drummer. And I think that's that. Just the naturalness, his innate ability, combined with his enthusiasm for drums and music, and his self-determination. He would do more for himself than most people who I've taught. That's why he is where he is today.
Being 2 years older than his brother, Justin sought his own path in the Lowestoft music circuit, leaving Dan and Ed to form their own bands. One of these was Superfast Big Muff, in which they were joined by vocalist Benson Reed.
Me, Dan and Ed had a band called Superfast Big Muff, and we used to practice in Ed's bedroom. We should make as much noise as possible at the end of the day, because we could do and stuff, and we were only teenagers and stuff, but that was what teenagers do, and that's what we done, you know. Superfast Big Muff was just probably an idea we had where we wanted to just play in a band, and that was it, purely that, and we didn't want to do loads of gigs, we didn't want to make any money of it, we just purely wanted to have fun and stuff, and that was what we done, yeah. And like I say, the only venue that we played was Colville House, and it was a one-off gig, but it's a one-off gig, so that's it really, yeah. It actually went bloody excellent, yeah. The first time I've ever been on stage as well, they actually had a stage there as well, and there was probably over 150 people there, and there's 3 bands on as well, you know, it wasn't just one band on, there's 3 bands on, and the whole day was spectacular, you know, it's just great fun, and that's the way music should be, I think, at the end of the day, so. Dan wasn't, he wasn't into skateboarding, which was a very big trend 10 years ago and stuff. He wasn't into that, he was into his music at the end of the day. Well, I knew for a fact that Dan would be a musician no matter what, yeah, that was in his blood, and from a young age, that's what to do, so that was that. But Ed, I don't know, I suppose Ed, he might have had other things, but like I say, at the end of the day, we were all young, and we didn't really want to, you know, find out what we were going to do in 10 years' time or so, you know, so we didn't really put much thought into it, really. Oh, the majority of the time was, well, actually spent in Ed's bedroom. You know, that's the truth of the day, yeah, we spent a lot of time in there because we were underage to go to pubs anyway, so that was the only place we could go to and stuff. But when we got to around about 17, 18, then we started going down the brewery, which is the local pub where teenagers used to hang out and stuff, and we used to go see live bands every Friday and Saturday there as well.
Despite its size, Lowestoft harboured a vibrant live circuit, and it was in venues like the Fighting Cocks and the brewery that the band members earned their dues in a plethora of musical acts.
I grew up in Lowestoft myself, and it's a pretty cool place to grow up, really. I mean, you've got a beach and loads of arcade machines and all that type of fun stuff, but also a really busy music scene in terms of being in bands and being into music, and playing music didn't seem unnatural, at least within the, it seemed like there really was kind of a pretty wide cluster of people who were in different bands, and kind of, it's fairly incestuous in the sense that, I'm sure there was lots of band hopping going on, and, also lots of Scrumpy Jack being necked.
There's always been a music thing going on. I mean, when Justin was doing it, when Dan was doing it, you would have all these youngsters, and I mean, I just can't think what age they would have been, but they were 14s and 15s and that sort of thing. Down there, Justin was old, obviously. But there were these little cliques that would go around, and there was somewhere to go, there was something going on somewhere that they could go off and do.
Whereas Dan and Ed would mainly perform in cover bands, Justin was already treading a more inventive and comedic path, assuming bizarre personae and delivering unique performances.
I think one of Justin's strangest incarnations, in his formative years as a musician, was Bionic Reg, kind of a one-man show in which he appeared as a particularly ludicrous superhero with a purple helmet on his head with a cardboard shark's fin coming out of the top. And I think it had an R on the front as well, and he was wearing a purple cape. And he would do these one-man shows and occasionally get random musicians up from the audience to play a load of nonsense, really.
It was Justin on stage, dressed very bizarrely, rolling around for half an hour. It was hysterical. It was funny. But I have no idea what the idea behind it, the concept was. It was just incredible.
He had like a cardboard penis hanging from his guitar on one occasion, and smeared tomato ketchup over himself to look like blood. And one eyewitness account insists that for one gig he was dressed as a tree spirit.
I think Justin always enjoyed what he did. And I think he was serious in his own right. I think he probably wasn't seen as serious because of the way he went about it. But yeah, I would say he was serious, yeah. But it was just so totally different. It's completely different to what anybody else was doing. And to see him play as Plastic Reg, which is the very first time I saw him, is something I'd never seen before. And he was into the whole thing. That was quite serious. But no, I don't know how many people took it seriously. I have no idea. Not many, I wouldn't have thought.
In the early 90s, Justin joined Biff, a local band touring the usual Lowestoft circuit. At this point, however, he was simply a guitarist, and his talents as a frontman would remain undiscovered for years.
Biff were really big at the time in Lowestoft and stuff. Probably because of the fact they played their own stuff and they weren't a cover band, which majority of bands in Lowestoft are, So, yeah, they had a good following and stuff, And, but I think all the band members now have left and departed and done other things apart from music, apart from Justin, I should say, who's, carried on his dream of making it famous, yeah.
Biff would go on to record a couple of demos and kind of, gig around the place. They mainly dealt in cover versions, really. I think they threw a couple of their own songs in there. Played a few gigs. And they used to do covers of songs like, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and just a really random selection of songs. But that was kind of, very true to the spirit of the Lowestoft scene back then. There were a lot of bands, but you didn't really get the impression, perhaps because they were, they were pretty young, that they were doing it really to get any kind of fame or, fortune. It was just fun.
In 1991, Biff split up. While Justin would remain in Lowestoft for the next 4 years, Dan took the plunge and moved to London, where he hoped his musical career would take off.
I think that kind of illustrated the difference at the time between the two brothers, because Justin, stayed in Lowestoft. He was still working. He kind of, he was still in loads of bands. There were so many bands that he was in, it's really hard to keep track of them. Bands like Fish Logic, From Their Heads Came, lung nugget, apparently, probably for a few weeks, you know, as the mood took him. But Justin didn't seem to have that kind of burning ambition, the same that Dan did. And so he kind of hung around Lowestoft, and he dropped out of his A-levels, Justin, and then he dropped out of Lowestoft College, where he had been doing a media course. And there was a period there where he was, you know, living in a fairly kind of desolate part of Lowestoft with his then girlfriend. And his friends kind of started to worry about him a little bit, because he'd be sitting there all day just watching daytime TV, kind of attempting occasionally to master the jingles that, you know, that he heard. But that would also become quite an important part of his development, because he ended up, you know, recording jingles for real for the likes of IKEA, Tango, Mars bars, you know, after quite a few years. But that was only after he finally left Lowestoft and went to Huddersfield Technical College.
While Justin studied music technology in Huddersfield, Dan struggled in London, working in various minor music industry jobs and supplementing his income with irregular work as a session musician.
Dan spent several years in London, you know, trying to get bands together, you know, putting ads in the local press, trying to find the right musicians, trying to find that right chemistry. And, you know, obviously it eluded him for some time. But all the time he tried to keep a day job that at least kept him, you know, really close to the music business.
In 1995, Dan's attempts at forming a band proved fruitful. A respondent to an ad he had placed in the music press was a Scottish bass player who had become both his flatmate and his future bandmate, Frankie Poulain. The first seeds of the darkness had been sown. While Dan and Frankie were forming what would become Empire, the precursor to the darkness, Justin had finished his course in Huddersfield and followed his younger brother south to the capital. Soon he too was enlisted in the fledgling band.
It was only when Dan, Ed and Frankie started the band Empire, you know, and they needed somebody to work the synthesizers, that they then thought of Justin, who by that time was kind of, you know, sleeping on Dan and Frankie's sofas, I think, around Shepherd's Bush. So they got him in there, and they couldn't find a singer. So, you know, lo and behold, eventually the penny dropped, and Justin, you know, took the front spot where he's obviously supposed to be. But I don't think that Justin's approach to vocals apparently worked very much with Empire, because they were quite a downbeat type of band, and apparently it just didn't really gel. But it had to be better than the previous singer they had, who was apparently pretty much like George Michael.
Empire was a band lacking in real focus, and by 1999 it had effectively split. Yet the band had met Sue Whitehouse, a vital ingredient of the future success story of the darkness, and a powerful ally to have on board.
Empire lasted for 2 years, pretty much, and I think the best thing to come out of those 2 years was the fact that the band, you know, I think quite early on attracted the attention of Sue Whitehouse, who would go on to manage the darkness. At the time, Sue was bookkeeper for a fella called John Best, who was the Verve's manager. And, you know, Sue persuaded John to splash out some cash on Empire and we hire out some rehearsal space or whatever, and just kind of put some support behind them. And, you know, I found it quite amusing, actually. I think it was last year, there was, John Best was quoted about, you know, what he felt about Empire at the time, and his two main recollections were the fact that they frittered away his money and that the bassist was very tall, which I thought was fantastic. You know, those are his two things that stood out. Thanks, John.
By the end of 1999, Frankie had left London for Venezuela, and the Hawkins brothers returned to Lowestoft for the holiday period. With doubts over their future in music, they drank away their sorrows. It was on the final night of the millennium, however, that the pieces of the darkness puzzle finally fell into place. With an impromptu karaoke rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody, Justin convinced Dan that there was still a future in the world of rock for the Hawkins brothers.
It's one of those perfect rock moments because, you know, allegedly Dan was standing there in the audience, you know, crying with laughter, but at the same time suddenly thinking, my God, this man should be the front man of the finest rock band in the world, and we should start that band.
With Frankie summoned back from his travels and Ed brought in to complete the rhythm section, the darkness was formed. A 5-piece to begin with, the second guitarist was replaced by Justin, who had become the focal point of the band. His dominant presence would be pivotal to their subsequent success.
Nowadays, it's really hard to imagine Justin, you know, without a guitar. As capable as he is, you know, a lot of frontmen kind of hide behind their guitars because they don't know what to do with the microphone. You know that Justin wouldn't have a problem with not having a guitar. But it's interesting that it almost happened by, you know, by default in a way, because their guitarist at the time, Chris McDougall, left the band fairly early on, I think. I gather after a few gigs, and, you know, Justin picked up the fallen guitar, and, you know, the next stage of rock history was hewn.
I think he is a fantastic frontman, a great showman. I mean, Robbie Williams is a great entertainer and a great solo artist. Justin Hawkins is a fantastic lead singer of the band. I mean, I don't think he was ever going to be the lead singer of the band. I mean, you know, the old story of I think it was Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve back in the pub in Lowestoft, and, you know, they're sitting there thinking, we're going to do the band, what's going on? You know, someone put 50p in the machine, and on comes Bo Rap, and they start doing the star jumps, and it was, I think Dan went, well, hold on a second, why don't you do it?
As a frontman, he is awesome. You know, he's completely in control. He's brilliant with the crowd. He can really play a room. I think he's a kind of combination of Freddie Mercury, Steven Tyler. You know, everything that's good about old 80s hair rock is there. Everything that's good about 70s glam rock is there. You know, I think his influences in terms of his appearance, obviously, are the Freddie Mercury and the, you know, almost Robert Plant as well to a certain degree. But in terms of his guitar playing, he's got a real Brian May tone, and the band have been, you know, have often been sort of put in the same sentence as Queen because of their sort of theatrical performances.
The guy struts in to the studio, you know, with cowboy boots on, fag hanging out of his mouth, amazing leather jacket, every little bit the front man says some arrogant statement about them being the best rock and roll band in the world, and you know what? You actually believe them. So, yes, he's a great frontman, because that's what frontmen do. They make you believe the hype.
With Sue Whitehouse back on board, Justin began penning the band's first songs. By late 2000, the Darkness were ready to be unleashed on the public. It was at the Camden Monarch that they made their full live debut.
I became aware of the Darkness in the year 2000, end of the summer, beginning of autumn. I just started promoting at the Monarch in Camden. And a friend introduced me to Ed, the drummer, saying they just got a band together, give a listen to the demo. So I got in touch with Ed. He sent me the demo, played it. First bar, I thought, what the hell is this? And then I totally loved it. I just played the song over and over again. I actually remember calling my sister, playing the song over the phone to her, and I thought they were great. I called them up. I called the band up and said, although they'd only done one gig and they didn't really have that much experience altogether as the Darkness, I liked it so much that they could have the headline if they wanted to, which was quite risky in promoting terms, but I thought, sod it. It was a great show, and since then, after that, I thought, guys, you can play for me any time, and they did. They played for me almost every month for a year.
To understand how shocked people must have been at the Barfly when the Darkness came on stage for the first time, I think it's probably important to have a look at the surrounding musical landscape, which was, for the most part, deathly dull. You know, they played, I think they played August the 12th, and that same week there were gigs from Turin Breaks, Coldplay, Badly Drawn Boy. There certainly wasn't a lot of traditional rock around. So, you know, when these four individuals, actually 5 individuals as they were then, strutted on stage and started playing this kind of ludicrous AC/DC-esque screaming barrage, you know, I'd imagine a few jaws would have hit the floor.
The whole thing became a huge group of friends. We'd all go out together, go to the same places, come to my nights on a Saturday night. It was when you look at it in retrospect, it was a scene, but, you know, like a music scene, but when you are in it, you're just going out with your friends. You don't think, oh, I'm hanging out with the Darkness. You're like, well, I'm going out with Ed for a pint. We're bored. We don't have anything else to do. It's that. But it was great fun. It was great fun. The whole thing was great fun, definitely.
By May 2001, The Darkness had gathered a small but loyal fan base, and they supplemented their stage show with a buffet tea for all attending, satisfying their audience's appetite both for food and for rock.
I think those buffet nights at the Verge were, they were just one example of the more outwardly comedic, I think, elements of the Darkness's shows back then. At those buffet nights, they also had a song that they performed in which they listed all the different types of food on the buffet, which obviously wasn't particularly sensible. They had a song called Hell's Gazelle as well, which they apparently dropped because they realised that a gazelle is actually a feeble antelope, and so that was never going to wash with the rock community. A lot of people seem to think that it was Dan who kind of pruned back that kind of, obviously silly element to the band. And I think that was probably just part of Dan and Justin kind of altering the chemistry, balancing their personalities. And, I think that was just, the natural evolution of the band. Obviously, there was still a really humorous element to what they did. So I'd imagine that Dan was keen for them to be taken, pretty seriously, even though they were a fun band.
As the band went from strength to strength as a live act, they soon began to get noticed by the national press. And the inevitable comparisons with classic rock acts of the 60s, 70s and 80s were often very favourable to the Lowestoft Quartet.
By combining lots of different elements, they've taken the best bits from all these different types of music. You've got the best bits from kind of AC/DC rock and roll riffs, rock and roll drumming and guitar playing. You've got the fantastic kind of theatrics of Queen, Aerosmith's kind of rock and roll persona is there too. They've just taken all these really good elements, rolled them into one ball and turned it into a very entertaining package and a very musical package.
I think they have taken their little slice of influences from all manner of different rock to create this new hybrid in 2004. I think it's a little bit of a lot of different things, but when you see him on stage at Nebworth supporting Robbie and he kind of steals the show, or when you see him play Glastonbury, or when you see him play this, that and the other, when I look at him on stage, I do see vast elements of Freddie Mercury. And I remember seeing Freddie when I was very, very young. I think one of the first gigs I ever went to was a Kind of Magic at Nebworth. And having lots of those DVDs at home to watch. When you see Freddie, when you see the band of Queen, the band I immediately think of now is The Darkness.
One of the many venues that the band played was the Notting Hill Arts Centre, and a couple of the DJs of that club were running their own label, a very small indie label called Must Destroy. Up until that point, they'd put out, a couple of 7-inches, as far as I know, by a couple of reasonably obscure bands. But eventually, having made contact with Sue Whitehouse, she rang them up apparently one day and said, "Would you like to put a single out?" And this was a fair way into the band's career, and I think it's still amazing that a label never even wanted to put out a single by the band. I think that's utterly ludicrous. But nevertheless, obviously Must Destroy, grabbed that opportunity and put out this single. It was a great debut single. Like most bands' debut singles, you get some of their best tracks they've spent years on. So you get, rather than some dodgy B-sides and remixes or a comedy recording of the drummer snoring on the bus, you had 3 great tracks.
The I Believe in a Thing Called Love EP was an indicator of the musical talent of the band. Yet it failed to secure them a record deal, and by the close of 2002, the unwillingness of labels to sign The Darkness suggested that while people wanted to watch their shows, no one was prepared to take the band further.
Around that time, people didn't quite know what to make of the band. I mean, for years, since pretty much immediately as soon as they started treading the boards at the Barfly, they had a fan base of A&R men who, really loved the band, but either didn't dare go back and tell their bosses that, we should sign these up, or they did go back to their bosses, tell them about The Darkness, and were, roundly laughed out of the office.
I think initially, when you first hear the band, and you hear this thing, this joke sound, this kind of amusing sound, it's difficult to take them seriously as a rock band. The initial impression is just this funny band, funny pub band. Great to go and see with your mates, but maybe you wouldn't want to go buy the record. And it was a slow period. It was, like you say, 3 years before anything really happened. But I think the reason it took such a long time is because, a lot of A&R people and record company people really don't know much about music. I think that's the secret there.
Would you touch them if they walked through your office looking like that, and with their hair and the tattoos and the bandanas and all that kind of stuff? I mean, they were a band who, on first inspection, was seriously trapped in another time. It isn't until you hear the music and you actually get what they were doing that you realise that quickly, sign this lot. You're onto an absolute goldmine here.
To be honest, the Darkness's success and their viability as a record-selling juggernaut wasn't exactly obvious at all, and it clearly wasn't obvious to every record company in the country. And I think it was really proven by sheer, the strength of their fan base and the fact they were filling out all these venues. They basically proved it themselves.
In February 2003, The Darkness's second single, Get Your Hands Off My Woman, was released to little fanfare and an indifferent record-buying public. Still gathering momentum live, supporting Def Leppard on a 9-date tour, the band decided to take their unique brand of rock across the Atlantic.
In March 2003, the band went back over to Austin, Texas for their second appearance at the South by Southwest event, which went down a storm, apparently. But this time when they came back, they weren't, touring around in a fruitless fashion in a transit van playing for 5 people. They were embarking on their own, UK headline tour, having supported, a few big-name acts like Def Leppard and built up a real profile by that point. At the end of the tour, they played the London Astoria, which is, 2,000-plus capacity, filled it out. And again, it was amazing to note that, this was an unsigned band.
The Astoria is the rock venue in London, I would say. Certainly the biggest mid-size one. Obviously, you can go on to Brixton Academy and onwards and upwards. But for that sort of level, for an unsigned band to sell out the Astoria, 2,000 people, that's a lot of people, especially up against the competition they've got, which I can't remember specifically, but it would have been, Good Charlotte and all the other bands who were around then. For them to go up against that with their kind of image, their kind of music, which was so different to anything else that was coming out at that time, very good indeed. What attracted me to them was that they played here in 2002 as support to a band called the Wild Hearts. And I get a big vibe from how many people ask for a guest list for a show or whatever. And I got more guest lists for the Darkness than I did for the Wild Hearts on that particular show. So I knew they were going somewhere. And when the agent rang me and said they wanted to do a show here, my ears pricked up. And that was about the time they were starting to get loads of press and everything. So I knew they'd do really well. The show in 2002, when they supported the Wild Hearts, flagged it up big time. And it was fairly obvious to me from then on, especially having seen the performance and how they went down at that show, that this was going to work big time.
Both the Def Leppard shows and the sellout Astoria gig proved that the Darkness were no passing phenomenon. And in May 2003, they were signed to East West Records. Yet whether the band were a mocking, ironic joke in the style of Spinal Tap, or whether they could be taken seriously like their various 70s rock idols, became the focus of critical debate in the music press.
If they're a joke, it doesn't matter that they're a joke, because it's a very funny joke. It don't matter at all. So I think they're a very entertaining band. And you can't watch them without smiling, without enjoying yourself. I think they're there to make people happy.
They do. I know lots of people have said that they do seem like Spinal Tap, but to me, Spinal Tap were one of the finest rock bands in the world because they didn't take themselves too seriously, nor did the Darkness. And music is just fun, it's a leisure activity, and if the Darkness are a modern-day Spinal Tap, then what's the problem? What's the problem in just having fun and not taking yourself too seriously?
I don't think there would be a Darkness if there wasn't a Spinal Tap. I think it's fairly obvious that they're using some of the more funny elements of that movie as part of their image, as part of the way they perform. And, you know, I'm just waiting for the bass player to get stuck in something, you know, on a live show, because, you know, he's a very cheeky-looking bass player. I think it'd be funny if he was stuck inside a giant egg or catacomb or whatever.
You know, I think Justin, you know, has always enjoyed the film Spinal Tap, just purely because it's amusing. The Darkness are a traditional rock band, yet they have kind of emerged, you know, post-millennium, and so they are aware of, you know, now 4 decades of rock's conventions and ludicrous things. But, you know, I think Dan said that, you know, people have forgotten that, you know, the very nature of rock is ridiculous, but it's fun. It doesn't mean you have to treat it lightly or, you know, be ashamed of what you're doing or, you know, take the piss out of yourselves.
In June 2003, the question of whether the band would be seen as lampooning the rock fraternity came to the fore when they played the Donington Festival. The comedy rock band Bad News had been jeered at the same festival in the 80s, yet the boys from Lowestoft managed to win the crowd over.
By the time the band did the Donington Festival, which is obviously, you know, a massive traditional rock event, but which has also kind of undergone its own development. You know, by that point it was called the Download Festival, so there was a hint of post-millennial kind of development going on there. And obviously, you know, it must have been in the back of the Darkness's minds that rock fans, you know, might have thought they were taking the piss and would literally throw piss at them in the form of bottles.
I think Donington worked for the Darkness because it's not that they're not pretending to be anything other than what they are, and I think their whole way of working, they're so tongue-in-cheek. Everything they do is tongue-in-cheek. Their lyrics are tongue-in-cheek. Their performances are tongue-in-cheek. If you've ever read an interview with them, you know that playing guitar solos makes your balls grow bigger. I mean, you know, that's a classic quote from Justin. I think it's because they are with the audience. You know, they're laughing with the audience. I think in the case of Bad News, it was at a time when they were ripping the piss out of what the audience was watching. You know, it was a badly timed joke, whereas the Darkness, people are having sort of seen Spinal Tap, having seen Bad News, people are used to that whole concept of ripping the piss and also pastiching all these great rock styles and putting them together. So I think people are more used to the idea.
The rock juggernaut that was the Darkness was now on a roll, and later that month the band released the single Growing On Me. It would be their first chart success.
The Growing On Me single reached number 11 in the UK charts, you know, obviously indicating that the band's star was very much on the rise. As Justin said, it was like having 2 number ones. Interestingly, the song is actually about sexually transmitted disease.
I think it's about warts, isn't it? Genital warts. And now, unfortunately, I can't play the song anymore without, you know, thinking of some kind of nasty clinic and thinking of Justin rubbing some talc onto something or other, you know? So it's kind of destroyed that song for me. It's still a good rock record, but I just think of warts or herpes or something not particularly pleasant when I hear it, so, yeah.
Justin seems to really enjoy giving songs fairly innocuous titles, but there's, you know, a whole world of sexual innuendo behind them. Or, you know, there's a song on the album which eventually emerged called Holding My Own. You know, I'll leave you to work out what that one's about.
I mean, I think the subject matter of their songs is, you know, it shows how much fun they like having. They're making a joke with their lyrics as well as their music and performance. And, yeah, if it is about an STD, then that's funny.
While the Growing On Me single surged up the charts, the Darkness supported Deep Purple at the Birmingham NEC. Following dates with Whitesnake and Def Leppard, the band were clearly being accepted by the rock establishment, and in 2003 they would go on to perform with past masters Alice Cooper and Meat Loaf.
First of all, what it says that, do you know what, we were invited to do this tour by Def Leppard. We were invited to do this tour by Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper likes our music, so, you know, if you want to like our music, Alice Cooper thinks we're pretty cool. What do you reckon? All those bands invited them to tour with them. So what that's saying is, these are the Darkness, this is the Darkness, tell us what you think. So it was a big seal of approval by those reputable artists.
I think a lot of the bands like Deep Purple, Meat Loaf, Def Leppard that are still filling stadiums even now are doing that because they're great bands. And I think they recognise that greatness in the darkness, and being associated with them is, you know, a lot of these guys, if they're in their 40s and 50s even, making money out of simple rock songs, you know, they're not going to be taking themselves too seriously, and I think with that maturity they've reached that point where, you know, who would you like to tour with? If you were on tour, who would you rather be your support band? Would you like it to be another rock band, or would you like it to be the Darkness? You know, if you can tour with the Darkness, you're gonna do it. And I think, you know, I can guarantee every single one of those bands, Alice Cooper, Def Leppard, they're all going to have listened to the Darkness's record on their tour bus for the last year or two.
At the end of June, the Darkness continued their extremely hectic touring schedule by playing the major venue of the British festival circuit, Glastonbury. Playing in the morning to a typically hungover and uninterested crowd, they nevertheless managed to bring their inimitable humour and sound to the dazed masses.
Who Gives You Rock Before Breakfast was Justin's opening line as they stomped onto the Glastonbury stage, you know, in about 10:30 in the morning or whatever it was. But, you know, they were establishing their ability to make a grand entrance as well, because they arrived at the site by helicopter. You know, that's the stuff of, clearly the stuff of rock gods.
While the band played the summer festivals, their debut album was released. Permission to Land was a shot in the arm to the British rock scene and would become one of the biggest selling records of 2003.
The band actually recorded Permission to Land before they were signed. I think it was late 2002 when they actually, you know, recorded it in a frenzied 2-week period. Permission to Land is a great album, and it doesn't actually, as far as I can remember, have any fillers at all. Maybe because, you know, some of the singles have been just, you know, kind of played to death on the radio. I think, you know, two of my favourite songs, you know, the ones I would tend to listen to when putting the album on a bit more, are, you know, songs that never made a single, like Friday Night or Giving Up, which are fantastic songs. But, you know, the point is, this wasn't an album with some great singles and then, you know, a load of old toss.
Love on the Rocks with no ice, you know? Love on the Rocks with no ice. Listen to the words. Are they taking a mick? Is it just a good record? It's the old school rock record. But everyone was like, this is hilarious.
It's a listenable album. It's a sort of album you can listen to and enjoy many times. In the same sense as, I don't know, like the Tenacious D record. It's a funny record. The jokes are good, but the music is good enough that you can enjoy the music or the jokes or both.
In August, the Darkness played to their biggest audience yet. Supporting the pop star Robbie Williams at Nebworth may have seemed a strange pairing, but what looked risky on paper worked wonderfully on stage, and a whole new audience became aware of the band.
I think the two of them are like peas in a pod, really. Robbie Williams has got a slightly different formula, but he's still a very theatrical performer and an enjoyable performer to watch. Fantastic songs. I think Nebworth, in the same way as, I guess, Donington, it's one of those venues that if you're a rock band, you have to play. And I think the two of them together is no surprise at all, because, you know, Robbie wears face paints, Robbie wears crazy costumes. You know, the two go hand in hand.
The band were apparently divided pretty much 50-50 as to whether or not to play the Robbie Williams dates. But I'm sure they were finally glad they did, because I think it turned out to be one of the most significant things they ever did in terms of securing mainstream appeal.
I think the Robbie gig was fantastic for the Darkness. I mean, as you say, it really was, the band really were playing to those cool, underground, new, trendy places like the Barfly and the Camden, the Palace and all that kind of stuff. And then they got invited to play Robbie at Nebworth. Now, that was a bit of a gamble, not only for Robbie, not only for the audience, but also for the Darkness. Now, when you turn up to go see Robbie, you wouldn't really expect a band like that on before him. Now, they completely stole the show, and I think the 100,000 people in the crowd were also quite surprised with what they saw. And what it did for the Darkness was brought their music to the mainstream, to the people who buy Robbie Williams albums. And they are the people that buy Robbie albums, Dido albums, and all the kind of big sellers. So Permission to Land went from being, you know, a cool rock album which not too many people had heard about, to a massive album that 100,000 people per night had heard, and they went away going, Robbie was fantastic, but who was that band on before?
I think playing a big show like Nebworth is going to be helpful in any circumstance. Both in, I mean, put it this way, Robbie Williams' fan base is enormous. Exposing the darkness to that fan base, they're going to love him. They love the band too. So, you know, it was a very shrewd move on their part because they're, if you like, doubling their fan base.
I think that was the one thing the Darkness did that just took them up to the next level. Suddenly they were virtually a household name. The Sun latched onto them in the Bazaar column, a picture of Justin, which I think was bigger than Robbie Williams. And, you know, from there on, it was just up and up.
The Darkness followed the massively successful Robbie Williams gig by supporting the Rolling Stones in Germany and taking the main stage at the Reading Festival. In September, they re-released I Believe in a Thing Called Love. Boosted by the thousands of newly acquired fans from their summer touring, the record rose to number 2 in the British singles chart and became an anthem countrywide.
I loved it. I loved the fact that it starts off with a really heavy rock riff, and then you get this fantastic falsetto, and it's a love song. I believe in a thing called love, you know. Everybody can relate to a love song.
You know, from the first time you hear that on the radio, it's just like, yes, what's this? Turn it up. I mean, I actually like playing the album version from time to time as well because it's kind of, it's a little bit more, that opening bit is a little bit more subdued, a little bit less produced. But when the single comes on, it's no mucking about, it's and it's just, that is a rock record. You're in, 10 seconds into it, you're like, what the hell is this?
The song has 2 guitar solos in it too, so it's a classic sort of rock arrangement. It has everything you could possibly want from a rock song.
Coupled with this incredibly camp, over-the-top video, you know, them running down, the guitar arriving from the ceiling. I mean, you could, I mean, again, we talk about Freddie Mercury. There was an incredibly camp video, and they did some incredibly camp videos where Freddie dressed up as a woman doing the hoovering. I mean, it's that kind of thing. And then this ridiculous creature, you know, the octopus or whatever attacking the spaceship. I think when, you know, the younger kids, the record buying public, saw that, they kind of liked it. And they went out and bought the single, whereas you and I thought, brilliant record, I'm going to go and find the album. And, you know, it's albums, I guess, that are the big business these days, so they can't lose. If the kids are buying the singles and we're buying the albums, that's why they're making a lot of money and a lot of good records.
I think that song, if you like, that song epitomises the Darkness. It has every element of what's good about them all packaged up in that one song.
You could go up to, I don't know, you go up to a bricklayer in the street and hum that song and they go, oh yeah, it's that band, it's that bloke with the high voice, isn't it? You know, you might not say bloke, you might say twat, but he knew who it was. You know, that's the thing, and I think that's one of the things about the Darkness, you know, even if you don't like them, those songs are in your brain and you are doomed.
With a hit single, TV appearances, music and tabloid press coverage, and huge sales of their album, the band had managed to rise out of their 2.5-year gestation period to conquer all before them.
Whether you might like the music or not, but I think they definitely deserve, you know, the huge success they have now, because they've really worked their asses off to get there. You know, they really have. You know, it was skint for ages and so on, but you know, carry on sticking to it instead of getting 9-to-5 jobs and rehearsing once a month. They didn't. They actually carried on with the band. So yeah, really well earned, definitely.
I think, do you know what, if we had done the whole Darkness thing for 6 months and then Simon Cowell popped up and said, guess what, you know what, I'm behind the Darkness, I wouldn't have been that surprised, because it went to such an extreme with the hair, the outfits, the tattoos, that it was almost like you'd gone to a book, how to be a rock band, or they'd hired out Spinal Tap, like you say, you know, and you could tick off everything. Hair, yes. Teeth, outfits, yes. Songs about this, that and the other. Incredibly camp videos. It was all there. So I wouldn't have been surprised if someone had turned around and said, do you know what, it's all a big marketing campaign, we've done it, ha ha ha, we proved that we could do it. But it wasn't, which means it actually goes completely other end of the spectrum, and it goes, well, this is what we wanted to do. These are the bands we admire, this is the band we wanted to make, here's the Darkness. You know, like us or lump us, we're going to do what we do. And I think that if the Darkness weren't the band that they are now, I think they'd probably still be doing gigs. I think they'd still be playing the London circuit, this, that and the other, or maybe even doing, you know, the odd sort of UK tour. But they'd still be doing it because that's what they know, that's what they love. Anything else, well, thanks very much, we'll have it. And I think now they've probably got more than they imagined they would ever have. You know, I can't imagine that they sat down and said, let's do this band. And even when they had permission to land done and dusted and it was ready to hit the stores, did they think, we're about to be the biggest thing that this country has seen for a very long while? I refuse to believe, even with Justin's immense arrogance, and I say that in the nicest possible way because he's a lovely man, but he's got the rock star arrogance. I don't think they ever thought they'd be this big.
In October, the band played the University of East Anglia in Norwich. If not a return to Lowestoft, it was a return to their home county, and local reaction in the seaside town of their youth was overwhelming. Radio DJ Stuart Lee covered the gig for Lowestoft station, the Beach FM.
At the time, that was the biggest thing to their homecoming gig that they'd done in the area. Finally, we get to see the Darkness because a few people were still unaware of, you know, the grassroots of the Darkness. When they did, you know, Growing on Me made it into the top 20, people were becoming aware of them, and, you know, on the front page of Kerrang and in the newspapers during the week, people were becoming aware of them, but they weren't aware that they never actually performed in Lowestoft as the Darkness. They weren't aware of the grassroots, and that's kind of really what sparked the hunger for people.
December saw the Darkness release a new single, not on their Permission to Land LP, Christmas Time, Don't Let the Bells End. A festive number, it once again saw the band climb up the charts and secure their place as Britain's premium and least predictable rock outfit.
I think it was a stroke of genius that the band released a Christmas single, you know, not just a single released at Christmas, but a single about Christmas. You know, bands just, especially rock bands, just didn't do that. You know, that hadn't happened since the days of, you know, Slade and Wizard in the 70s, but, you know, clearly the Darkness didn't care at all.
I think the whole Christmas single thing just shows how much on the money their marketing people and their management are, or, you know, how genuinely up on the industry that the band are, because to sell records at any time of the year is a good thing. To sell a Christmas record when people are buying gifts is a brilliant thing. You know, they make an awful lot of money doing that, and I think they did very well to have done so. How far up the charts you get to number 2? Yeah, if you got to number 2 in the Christmas charts, you're making a packet of money.
It was an odd one. You know, you don't normally get a rock band releasing a Christmas single. I mean, I think I remember when the song was out and we were doing the whole, you know, are they going to be Christmas number 1? Aren't they going to be Christmas number 1? I remember looking back and I don't think there'd been a decent Christmas number 1 for 10 years. I mean, E17, Mr. Blobby, Bob the Builder, the list goes on, but I won't bore you to tears. So, you know, I was really rooting, you know, for a Christmas number 1 from a credible band.
The fact it had the word bell end cunningly concealed in the title. I don't think the release of, in some people's eyes, you know, I don't think the release of the single would have done much good for their reputation among certain people as being, you know, a joke band. But I think by that point, the band just didn't care. There's definitely a difference between, you know, being amusing and having fun and, you know, just taking the piss, really. You know, they were just, you know, having a laugh, celebrating Christmas and having a great time. You know, whether or not other people saw that as a total joke, novelty sellout, I think was probably academic by that point because they were already massive.
Following their nomination for the Mercury Music Prize and their success in the MTV Europe Awards, the Darkness started the new year in style, dominating the Brit Awards in February 2004.
They came that night to collect their awards, and their awards were for the best UK band, the best rock outfit, and the best album, and so on and so on, and they went away with them. And if they hadn't, I would have been surprised. I'd have been quite annoyed as well, because in 2003 they were the most exciting band we played on this radio station, bar none. The Brits even came up with a new category that year, Best Rock Band, okay? You know, they might have called it Best Band beginning with the word dark and sounding in ness. You know, it was, they'd won that award before they even turned up, and they knew it. You know, there they turn up to the Brits in, you know, some huge, great sports car, coupled with lots and lots of bikers at either side of it. The whole thing was a show, and they knew that they were there as the best band in the UK in 2003.
In 1 year, The Darkness had managed to alter their fan base from a cult following to international recognition. And with intensive touring in America in 2004, they intend to go global. Yet back in Lowestoft, there's still hope for a real homecoming gig.
There is a local pride. You know, the Bring Back Darkness campaign to Lowestoft is echoed by everybody. You're spanning generations. You're talking, as I said to you, grandparents, aunties, uncles, kids, you know, kids, really small kids to, you know, late teenage kids. Everybody wants to be there when The Darkness play at this Lowestoft gig. And, you know, when it does eventually happen, and they're talking summer of 2005, I understand, it will be a magnificent event which will just have huge benefits for the area. They would probably echo that. I think, you know, in the back of their minds with all their current tours in America and schedule that they've got to follow, in the back of their mind is this homecoming gig. And it would be nice for people around here to see them on the global stage, to see them at the Brits, and then to see them, for example, on Ormiston Park or Patefoot Rifle Range.
Well, the town would love it. And this is where this live venue comes in, because they want to come back here, but they're going to put them on a football field. It's a bit sort of lower stuff for you.
Whether they return to the hometown or not, the local affection for The Darkness has become international, and their distinct approach to music in these conformist times marks them out as uniquely successful in finding such a large audience.
I have nothing against bands like Muse and Radiohead and Keane or whatever, but they're terribly serious. They're terribly... It's angst. It's from here. All The Darkness want to do is strap on some guitars, put on some jumpsuits and have some fun. And I think people are kind of getting a little bit fed up with the angsty, you know, I'm so depressed, I'm so whatever. Let's bounce about and have some fun.
As far as, you know, secret to the band's success goes, I think number one, it has to be the power of the songs. You know, you can do as many comedy cartwheels on a stage and a pair of silly trousers as you like, but if you've got rubbish songs, then, you know, your appeal will be limited. And The Darkness write great songs. You know, Justin always has. You know, he's got such a great ear for a catchy song. But also, I think it really boils down. You can be as, you know, scholarly about it as you like, but it boils down to the fact that the band are fun, and they're also fearless. You know, they just don't really care what anybody thinks about them patently, and it's paid off.
I guess when they were sort of playing pubs, they didn't have a clue how big this thing was going to hit. And it's an indicator of how much there is a hole for that kind of entertaining band in the market. I mean, I guess the best thing about them is that they appeal to such a huge range, such a massive fan base. Kids love them because they're hilarious and they're funny and, you know, they rock. People that like rock music, classic rock music, like them because they sound good and it reminds them of all the things they like. And I think, you know, parents of the kids like them as well because, as I say, it brings back memories for them. It allows them to... Their kids are getting into a guitar band. It's better than any of the crap that you hear in the charts. It's not bootish buntish. It's not got some little plastic girl singing over the top of it. It's not manufactured. It's real rock and roll. And you know, I think that's their secret. Is they're a real band, a real rock and roll band, who have packaged their music in a really entertaining and exciting way.
Bottom line is, they sell records. They have a good time, and they've. I don't think any of us can put our finger onto what it is that they struck upon. If they hadn't come along, would someone else come along and done the same thing? I don't know. But they did it, and they did it at the right time. Now, whether they are a one-album wonder, we're going to have to wait and see.
I think they're going to have a fucking hard job with their second record. It's going to be really difficult to, like you say, make the joke last. Because the thing is with humour, I think humour fads go a lot more quickly than musical fads. And unless that joke is still funny in a couple of years' time, that we're probably going to see the end of the Darkness, and I think it would be... I think they're a savvy enough bunch of lads, musically and, you know, in an industry sense, that I think they'll develop, and we'll actually see them get bigger and bigger, and I think they'll start to, you know, I certainly see them being along the lines of Queen. There'll be a stadium-filling band for a long time, and I think part of that is because they know what they're doing.
Having successfully conquered Europe with their unique brand of rock wizardry, the Darkness are now concentrating on breaking America, a difficult market to infiltrate and one that has defeated many a British success story.
There's a danger when you come to America as a UK, as a successful band in the UK, that you think that it's all on a plate for you. It'll all go the same way that they went in the UK, and I think Oasis must have strutted in, you know, 4.5 foot tall, whatever they are, thinking, oh, God, this country's ours for the taking, you know, and then as soon as it doesn't go their way, they think, ooh, that's not quite working, is it? Should we go back to the UK where we're really popular and successful? You know, knock it on the head, can't bother with this. And that's just, for me, it's laziness and...
Arrogance.
Well, it's arrogance, but at the same time, they're kind of probably reluctant to leave their hardcore following, which only exists on one tiny island.
Personally, we've all got, you know, different ideas of what breaking America means. But I mean, for me, it means becoming untouchable in a way.
I think it means selling 10 million records. Having a diamond-selling record in America is the goal. It might not be this one, it might be the next album, but Rome wasn't built in a day.
With a second album on its way, there can be little doubt that the Darkness will continue to plough their own unique path through the modern music scene. Irreverent, entertaining, talented and grounded, this peerless Lowestoft four-piece is surely set to continue writing itself into the history of rock music.